Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. I am Patrick Cummings, here as always with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week we aim to simplify the principles and practices of nutrition, health, and fitness. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. How the heck are you, E.C.?
Wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm great. We're going to talk about, I was really excited when you sent me a note that we were going to do this because this is one of those things that I was like, I should send EC a text to see if we're going to talk about this. But I was like, I think we're going to. So we are. We're going to talk about the recently released and updated dietary guidelines here in the U.S. Specifically, we're going to talk about your 5 practical takeaways from your review of the guidelines, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right, cool. Before we jump in, just a very quick reminder to folks, if you haven't yet checked out the 3 Pillars Method app, well, what are you waiting for? 3pillarsmethod.com. If you listen to this show, that is the natural next best move for you. 3pillarsmethod.com. Okay, let's talk about these guidelines. They were everywhere that I looked for about 2 days
Yes.
when they came out. So let's get a little bit of, in case anybody else is maybe not on the internet too much, like what's going on here? What are we talking about? Why are we talking about it now?
Yes, the USDA releases new dietary guidelines every 5 years. And to do that, before the new guidelines come out, they have a dietary guidelines advisory committee that reviews all of the existing research, any new research since the last guidelines were issued, and makes these scientific recommendations for potential changes in the guidelines. And so that committee report came out at the end of December 2024. And it's a joint effort between the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services. And when that report comes out, it is actually also submitted to the public and available for public comment. And so it's between that report and then the public comment that ultimately the USDA and the HHS then author these new guidelines. Now, what's of course interesting about this most recent evolution or this most recent release is that we've had a change in the administration between the committee's scientific report and then kind of the finalization of these guidelines that got released. And so the new administration, decided to accept and reject some things that they thought were more important or less important between this committee report and also the release of their guidelines. And so what everyone saw this past weekish is this release of, shall we say, an upside down pyramid with kind of the tagline of eat real food, and definitely some more, at least picture and text emphasis on animal foods than we've seen in previous years. And I do want to point out that if you look at the committee who wrote the most recent guidelines that just got released, not the committee report, there are a lot of financial ties to the beef and dairy industry, which is a little bit LOL to me because, there's a lot of people who go on and on about the fact that, okay, doctors are in bed with big pharma. So where's all the outrage about the fact that these diet recommendations happen to be in bed with the big food industry players? But I digress.
That's a different talk show.
Yeah, I know. That's another podcast episode, I guess. The other thing, though, about this new upside down pyramid is it did cause a lot of people to talk about, oh gosh, the old food pyramid that the USDA had. Now, it's important to know that that old food guide pyramid with the grains at the bottom went away in 2005. It went to an updated version of the pyramid with like kind of these vertical stripes. And any form of a pyramid went away in 2011 with My Plate, which basically shows half of a plate with fruits and veggies and, protein, etc. I bring that up because, 15 years ago is when we switched to My Plate. And so sometimes when people are like, oh, thank God they finally updated the pyramid, it's like, well, where have you been? Because you clearly weren't actually paying attention to the guidelines.
Yeah, that's how bad at marketing they are. It takes about 15 to 20 years for anybody to think they're paying attention, but they've missed so much in between those. Cool.
Right.
Got it. Okay, that's a good little background. Let's jump right into our 5 practical takeaways from your review. Do you want me to just go one at a time and we'll break them down?
Let's do it.
Cool. All right. So number 1 that you sent me, the practical relevance of the new guidelines is minimal.
Yeah. Yeah, this was a big week for me, Patrick, because this is the first week I have legitimately been asked about the USDA dietary guidelines in my career working in nutrition. I mean, even at CrossFitter, I was involved in nutrition, of course, not full-time or anything like that, but then the last 8 years just dedicated with Optimize Me Nutrition only. I've never been asked directly about the guidelines. And I bring that up sort of in jest, but I bring it up because I do think it's really important to understand that the average American And even the above average nutrition informed American, as our audience is, does not go to the guidelines for nutrition advice, right? Yes, we have talked about them here on the podcast. It's more because I try to untangle the idea that the government is trying to kill us. But I never get these questions that are like, EC, I noticed the guidelines move lentils from the vegetable category into the protein group. How should I handle this?
Yep.
I never get those questions. And so I think it's really relevant because it's this main point that I would love for people to understand about the guidelines. The problem is not the guidelines. The problem is no one is following the guidelines. And as much as I think this most recent version of the guidelines is a little bit goofy from a science point of view, our nation's health would still be way better off if people followed them, including these new ones. I mean, for one, the literal first main recommendation is the same as it's always been, quote, eat the right amount for you, continuing, quote, the calories you need depend on your age, sex, height, weight, and level of activity. Okay, 74% of Americans are overweight or obese, meaning their caloric needs are off. So a majority of people aren't meeting the first recommendation that's been there literally since day one of the guidelines. Another example, even within these new guidelines, they are still recommending 5 servings combined of fruits and veggies per day, which, as we've said a bunch, 90% of Americans aren't doing. So again, I'm going to kind of point out some of where the science is a little bit silly in certain areas, but, these guidelines aren't going to have this big change in our nation's health. The real relevance of these guidelines is not directing, let's say, our community's nutrition approach. The real relevance of these guidelines tends to be that it influences school lunches and let's say hospital programs, and maybe even how things can be marketed, like the front of packaging labeling that we've talked about. So there is going to be some trickle down effect. I don't want to say that it's irrelevant, but in our sphere, in my clients and demographic, it's way more about viral social media influence. I've been asked way more about Glucose Goddess or Peta Urtia or Stacey Sims than anybody has ever asked about what the USDA says.
Yep.
And so, it's like how powerful are these really for a lot of people's day-to-day application? And as we've discussed ad nauseum, it's really the food environment that is the big influencer for everyone, not the guidelines and not even, quote, the Glucose Goddess or whoever. So until any administration can make real change in the food environment, these guidelines can almost say anything and nothing changes to a significant degree. And just as a silly aside, when I was reviewing the guidelines over the weekend, they made this statement about how their version is so different and has got all this new stuff in it. And they did that because the last 10 versions of the guidelines have failed to reduce chronic disease to any significant degree. And I just sort of love the hubris to think, oh, okay, your new set of guidelines is going to do it. Okay, go ahead. We'll see.
Yeah, it turns out the problem is in the guidelines, as you said. Okay, good. Takeaway number 2, there is the exact same limit on saturated fats, so the guidelines are not more pro-meat or dairy.
Yeah. One of the main premises of the guidelines as a whole, and which to, I think, a large degree is useful, but also not that different from the last guidelines, is this premise that whole foods should be the default food recommendation. So that is good. Note, that's not really a difference from the last guidelines, but that's okay. However, when we take a look at this new upside down pyramid, we've got steak, cheese, red meat, and whole milk really taking over the top left corner, which of course is what everybody sees first reading left to right.
That's right. Yep.
And there's also places, as I mentioned in their text, where you can see their recommendations. They're kind of pushing this more meat, full fat animal products, like specifically calling out beef tallow and butter for cooking as an example. So the more animal-based pro-meat crowd seems to be fired up about this because at least, again, in pictures and talking points, this beef and dairy seems to be more encouraged than previous guidelines. However, in the incorporate healthy fats section, it says, quote, in general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of total daily calories, end quote. That is the exact same guideline as it was before. So it's not really an increase in animal products in the diet. And as before, most people will need to reduce their saturated fat in the diet to achieve this guideline. Of course, they need to reduce most everything in the diet because on average, we're eating too much of everything. Pick any calorie producing nutrient. We probably need to eat less of it, including saturated fat. But anyway, to demonstrate that this guideline really isn't a pro-animal-based diet or a pro-saturated fat diet, which is our largest source of saturated fat, 10% of calories in the diet, let's walk through an example using a 2,000 calorie a day diet, 10% of that ends up being about 22 grams of saturated fat. That's really not that much. That's really not that much. That's about a cup of whole milk, a little bit more than a cup of whole milk, a tablespoon of butter, and a palm-sized serving of 80/20 ground beef on the day. So, that's going to get you already to this 10% limit. And that's assuming that no other foods in your diet have any saturated fat in them, which is not going to be true because even things like olive oil have saturated fat. So good luck trying to increase your full fat dairy and beef to any significant degree if we're going to stay at 10% of calories in the diet. So you might ask though, like, okay, well, if they're very pro beef and dairy, why didn't they increase that 10% caloric limit? Well, they don't have the evidence to. Then we go back to the scientific report. It's like, yeah, they don't have the evidence to be able to do that. We've talked, I know even recently we had kind of an episode about LDL cholesterol and heart disease risk and saturated fat. And I don't want to kind of go through all of those points, but I do want to make this broad point about the recommendation for calories for saturated fat to be about 10%. I think it's very level-headed, and I think it's a very logical reason why we end up there. So let's just kind of walk through it. If you end up eating the amount of protein that I recommend, or slightly higher, the 1 gram per pound that's so popular on social media, and you don't do anything really crazy with your diet, like you don't try to be high fat, you don't try to be high carb, you just eat a good amount of whole foods, you eat this kind of 0.7 grams per pound of protein or higher, you're generally going to end up with a mixed, balanced-ish macronutrient diet where about 40% of the calories are coming from carbs, 30% of the calories are coming from fat, and 30% of the calories are coming from protein. Now, it won't work out perfectly to those numbers, but it's going to be somewhere in this general ballpark of a mixed macronutrient diet. From there, we have 3 types of fat. We've got monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated. So if you've got 30% of calories in the diet coming from fat, the idea that each one of those types of fat gets about 10% of calories is kind of a very logical, non-extreme conclusion. So I feel like we kind of keep running around and around on the idea of saturated fat in the diet. And it's just sort of like, okay, if we eat in a mixed, balanced macronutrient way, which is, I think, one of the best ways to eat because it allows us to include a diversity of foods in the diet, which helps with sustainability, which helps us achieve all of our nutrient endpoints besides saturated fat, we often will end up in this ballpark of 10% of calories coming from saturated fat. So main points here are 1, the new guidelines don't actually change that level. And 2, in practical application, this is generally where it's going to kind of shake out anyway.
Got it. When you get to the third pillar with folks, do you ever look specifically, or do you spend a lot of time and effort looking at saturated fat? Or is it, again, to your point, is it like once we get to that point and once we're eating this diverse array of foods, it sort of balances it out and we don't have to worry about it too much from there?
We definitely look at it. We look at some other markers like fiber and saturated fat. And just depending on kind of diets people have come out of, sometimes we will have to make some specific changes. And so it can be a targeted approach at that point. But generally, a lot of times we can end up being pretty good on this number without having to micromanage it.
Got it. Okay, cool. Takeaway number 3, the new format is good in concept, but poor in execution. What does that mean?
So one of the things I really do like about the new guidelines, at least in concept, is that they have this 10-page summary of the guidelines. And I do think just generally the USDA needs to do more printable, shareable stuff. I mean, we all saw that. You even, mentioned you saw the new pyramid, you saw the stuff being shared. Like 10 pages is really useful as a document if you want people talking about this thing and to try to get people understanding this thing. And I appreciate the challenge of, okay, hey, just go make a 10-page document summarizing nutrition needs for the entire US. Like,
Yep.
I get it.
Some poor intern responsible for that.
Right. Like I get it. It's a pretty daunting challenge, but I love the attempt because that is actually what people would potentially look at. Like you're certainly not going to get everyone to look at it, but if you want people to take a look at it, we got to do something simple and we got to do something that is going to be read within a few minutes. The last guidelines were just this single 164-page document, which, to be honest, were quite well written, but people aren't reading that. They're not even going to open it to go through the abstract and the summary. So this is where having these things that are really, eye-catching or digestible, I guess, pun intended, I think are really useful. And I think My Plate the showing of the plate and the showing what a plate looks like is quite good. But the fact that nobody remembers it, I think also speaks to how little it was shared, right? So we need more of that stuff. People are too far removed from being nutrition literate or whatever, too busy in their lives to like dive into a 164-page report. And, I also appreciate that USDA doesn't have the largest marketing budget, especially when we compare things to like supplements or any big food corporation. But I assure you their budget's higher than mine. And, we can do these things with these plates and these photos that really help people to understand what this stuff actually looks like. And so I love the attempt to have something like that. And I think we need more of that just generally. Okay, so good in concept. Execution, okay, didn't do so well. I mean, I'm reading through this 10-page document and I'm thinking, do any of you actually work with clients? Have you ever fielded a single question from a client that's trying to make a diet change? I mean, of course the answer is no, but the practical utility of this 10-page document is like nobody is going to actually use it. Because first of all, let me tell you how many people can tell you 10% of their calories in terms of saturated fat grams, the math that I went through earlier. Let alone, okay, now I have this number of saturated fat grams. What foods in my diet would increase or decrease that? I mean, okay, less than 1% of the American population can do that, right? So I would suggest at least not just putting out there, okay, keep saturated fat to 10% of your calories in your diet. Okay, what is that in terms of grams? Where are they going to find that information? What foods increase or decrease that, right? Like actually go through those steps for them. Another example in this 10-page document, the protein recommendation. They actually have increased the protein recommendation from the RDA, which is fine. I'm not totally convinced we need to do that for the non-active population, which is most of the US, but nevertheless, they increase the protein recommendation and they give it in terms of grams per kilogram. Now, I appreciate that because that's how the scientific literature reports that.
Yep.
Okay, how many Americans are going to know how to do the math to get their weight into kilograms to then do the math on the protein multiplier? Like they just should have said, especially since we know that most people are sedentary, something like, okay, 90 to 120 grams per day of protein is going to be great based on these heights, short, average, and tall heights. That would have been way more useful for somebody to actually put this into practice instead of grams per kilogram to a US audience. Like, who are you talking to? Okay, the whole grain serving. They recommend 2 to 4 servings of whole grains. What's a serving of whole grains? How is a person supposed to know that? If you're referring to the serving that's on the back of the nutrition label, okay, tell them that. How do they know that it's a whole grain versus not a whole grain? Like, my God, if you're trying to make this thing useful, you need to think about the person who is using it. And the person who's using it on average, A, is not good at math, and B, certainly does not understand math in relation to nutrition. So good intention, like that step, really poor in execution.
Okay, let's keep going. Number 4, it was not written by anyone who understands nutrition science.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of builds on that last point. But there are a couple of things that kind of made me smile, especially reading the 10-pager, besides the points that I already kind of point out. First, quote, when cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty acids such as olive oil. Other options can include butter or beef tallow, end quote. Okay, so basically they're in this sentence talking about cooking, and they include in that prioritizing oils with essential fatty acids. Okay, essential fatty acids are polyunsaturated fatty acids, which the authors actually don't like. When you go into their supplemental scientific report, they discuss how unstable and how quickly they oxidize. This is all of the stuff out there about seed oils. But here in the summary, they are recommending to cook with them. They also go on to say that olive oil is one of these examples that would prioritize oils with essential fatty acids. No, olive oil is a good source of monounsaturated fatty acids, where the essential fatty acids are omega-6 and omega-3, both are which polyunsaturated fatty acids. So olive oil is not a good source of that. So, I mean, this statement is just sort of like, huh? What are you actually recommending here? Another one when I was reading through is they talk about, this is actually a change from the last guidelines, is they recommend no added sugar. Before they had kind of a certain low limit. Now they're actually saying no added sugar. And I'm all for cutting down on added sugar and processed food consumption, of course, as we've discussed, but it doesn't need to be zero. And so they say, quote, while no amount of added sugars or non-nutritive sweeteners is recommended or considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet, one meal should not contain no more than 10 grams of added sugars, end quote. I mean, it might not sound that silly, but it's funny to me to even bother with saying, okay, no added sugar, but it's in the same sentence of saying, well, some.
Mm.
If you want to know why Americans are confused about what to eat, this is a great example. We've got two different recommendations in the same sentence. Don't have any, have up to 10 in one meal. And so it's like I put that example in there because no real nutrition scientist would say no added sugars because essentially the added sugars are the same chemical composition as the sugars that are in your fruits and vegetables. We know it doesn't have to go to zero. Of course, we want people to cut down on it, but like, don't say no and then some. I mean, what's the messaging here? How is somebody supposed to enact this? And so it's just, again, just kind of made me smirk a little bit. It's like, okay, zero, zero thought went into that sentence.
So number 3 and number 4, I think number 3 was the people who wrote it seemed to not have any experience with real life nutrition. And number 4 is it seems to be written by people with no nutrition science background. Yeah. Is that just the process, like the process of putting this thing together has so many different hands in it that of course the result of it is like this kind of mishmash of opinions and facts and perspectives and things that are important versus things that aren't important? Is that just kind of like, should we expect anything different, I guess is the question?
I think, oh yeah, that's a great question. That could probably be its own podcast. Yeah, I think there's certainly going to be some of that. There's no way that the person who's having the original thought or guidance is also the person designing the 10-page PDF. I mean, we've had errors in our social media published and we're two people, right? So you can only imagine it is going to increase for sure. I would hope, though, a 10-pager that's going out to all of the United States would get a couple QCs.
Yeah. More
so than you and I are able to provide on our stuff. Anyway, so I do think there is a little bit of that. I also, though, think, and this is something that is a whole separate skill set, is you do need people that are truly the science people, and truly science people are often not the communicators. Mm-hmm. This doesn't necessarily excuse the whole fatty acid line in there, but like when you tell like a true scientist or somebody who's very, neck deep in nutrition science, keep your saturated fat calories to 10% of the total, they're like, sure, got it. They don't still work with clients. They're so neck deep in understanding the studies that have looked at saturated fat contribution on a percent calories diet, but they're not working with clients because that's not their job. So I do think there is this big chasm, and what I think there are a lot of skilled people on social media trying to do, and that is to try to translate the complicated research into something, okay, what is this person actually going to do come Monday in the kitchen? That's what I really love to try to help people with. It's like, okay, we've got all these PubMed studies. Yep. We've got all these really complicated ideas. Like, what are we actually going to do? And that is its own skill set. And I certainly think we could have more of that kind of bridge the gap between what they're doing from a research point of view and then what they're doing to actually make this useful for the American public point of view.
Right on. All right. Last takeaway. The appeal to more rigorous scientific evidence is commendable, but poorly applied.
Yeah. We've done a lot of these podcasts where we do go through a study and this one says this and this one doesn't say that. I'm happy to do more of those, but I kind of wanted to just hammer the broader point here because some of that stuff just sort of gets into he said, she said. There's a couple main premises they lay out for the guidelines, and one I mentioned earlier, and that is that they sort of are going to default to this idea that whole foods are always the more ideal food choice, which generally is okay. At extremes, we're going to have problems, like a whole food carnivore diet is not better than a somewhat processed food level diet if we're talking about, kind of at caloric needs, blah, blah, blah. But nevertheless, it is a pretty good general push and sentiment foundational idea. But then their second big premise is that randomized control trials are the gold standard for science, and there needs to be more of these high quality randomized control trials that really establish causal evidence specifically for disease outcomes like having heart disease or having cancer to make any recommendations if the recommendation is not going to recommend these whole food default choices. And so they really rely on that idea or concept that we need these more robust randomized control trials, especially in their saturated fat section, to basically say there isn't enough of this high quality research to suggest that saturated fat is a health problem. Okay, so two kind of comments on that. They are right in the sense of, yes, a lot of nutrition research really isn't that great. And yes, it would be great to have these really large randomized control trials for years to establish clinical outcomes like death and disease instead of a lot of the observational studies that we have. But we have this thing called life and reality to deal with where, large sample sizes, super controlled trials don't exist because otherwise healthy individuals aren't giving up 2, 5, 10 years of their life to live in some super controlled trial for low to no pay. So it's like a great talking point. We need more high quality research. And of course, every nutrition scientist out there is going, yes, we know. But, if there's no studies that meet your criteria in 2025, you should probably pause and ask yourself why, right? This also means then, how would they have the evidence to make changes, like to suggesting no sugar should be added, or in the case of we need more beef and butter in the diet? Like, if you're going to make this point that we don't have any good research, it cuts both ways. Yeah. And so, of course, this is where it gets into the he said, she said part, but they cite plenty of low quality evidence to make their point. And they also make it a point to bring up in these guidelines, they're going to look at some, quote, emerging evidence, which, of course, are not large scale, repeated human randomized control trials for a lengthy amount of time when it's, quote, emerging evidence. So this is where it gets really goofy. It's like, I appreciate that you want to have this kind of standard of saying we're only accepting gold level science, but it's like, yeah, that doesn't work for your case either. You didn't apply that to yourself. So again, that's kind of a great talking point for headlines, but it ultimately kind of shuts down the conclusion that they'd like to make in the science that they cite as well. And so that's what I mean is like the science is kind of goofy. It's like, okay. But all in all, in summary, like I really don't think much changes here. I think we've got this social media flurry for a couple weeks or two. Some parties have some certain talking points to capture support or not, but no real change was going to happen. I guess maybe my final takeaway, although I didn't outline it as a sixth takeaway, is it's just like incredibly frustrating to me. When you go through these reports, mind you, this had a 10-pager, a supplemental scientific report at 90 pages, and an appendix that was over 400 pages. You've got this list of highly qualified people, like multiple committees over multiple years to put these things together, even if it's not done well. The amount of spending that goes into it, not just the millions and millions that went into this evolution, but probably billions over the years of all of these different evolution of the guidelines. It's just like, guys, this isn't it. Like, I don't really see much hope for change here until we actually change the modern food environment. And so that's really where I would love for people to get more rallying around. It's like not what is printed on the cover of the upside down pyramid, but who in the administration or which administration is actually going to change the modern food environment.
Really interesting. The note about emerging evidence reminds me of what we've talked about with cutting edge science.
Exactly.
Where they're trying to spin we're not really sure about this and do something that sounds more positive.
It's crazy. If you were going to say that you were only going to take super well powered, meaning tons of sample size, high quality randomized controlled trials, let alone, I'm sure that they're going to say, of course we want the results repeated because of course you need to see science repeated across independent parties. I am going to tell you it cannot be emerging evidence.
Yeah.
It's going to be the tried and true basics because that's the only thing that we've had enough time to look at time and time again. So trying to weave in emerging evidence in the same idea of we only take super high quality stuff is just LOL.
Yeah. I think last question, which is just, do you have any big takeaways at the fact that for the first time ever, somebody or multiple people asked you about the guidelines? Is that a sign is that a good sign? Like, hey, maybe people are paying attention to these things. Maybe they are asking questions. Maybe they are trying to figure out, okay, yeah, like I know it says that and that's a little too sciencey for me, but like, what does that actually mean? Or is it just a sign of, I don't know, just the noise everywhere about everything all the time now?
Yeah, so Dr. Jessica Nurek, she's got a very large following and she does a lot on politics and policy. And I think she says it quite well that Make America Healthy Again largely has the problem right. We do have a chronic disease epidemic. And I think from that standpoint, they have captured the attention of paying attention to it. And then, she goes on to say how to fix it is wrong. As we've discussed, it's not going to be with artificial dyes being eliminated. Like, we have to cut down on processed food. But there is, I think, more attention in the mainstream to what people are saying about food and the chronic disease epidemic. And I don't want to say that the end justifies the means or anything, but I do think there is more attention to this, and that potentially could be good, and again, I'm really interested to see, like, can anybody make a dent in the modern food environment? Like, the guidelines aren't going to spin me up. Like, what can we do to cut down on that? And that's going to be where I could really rally behind and support something. Yeah.
Do you think that that should be the ultimate goal of something like, every 5 years when this new guideline comes out? Is the goal, maybe the goal is this, and it just perhaps fails at it, which is to actually change behavior on the individual level? Or, as you said before, where you kind of mentioned, like, a lot of this ends up trickling down to schools or hospitals, but is it that it fails to even have the right aim or goal, which is, like we talk about all the time, actually changing individual behavior within the context that we find ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's just a huge scope of what this is trying to do. It is supposed to be giving directives to the American population on what's a generally healthy diet. But then in addition to that, it is also have these trickle-down effects to all of these programs and setting regulations around how much sugar can be in foods that are then labeled healthy. So sometimes I think it's almost like a scope problem. Like, how are you going to be the great person at coming up with these infographics for the Gen Pop, but then also be like neck deep in understanding how we're doing front of packaging label for the code of federal regulations? So it's just an enormous scope. I don't know that I have the best answer for that. I do think that there probably could be a little bit more push in the sense of what we can really do for the American public to create a change. And I think if we've learned anything over the last 10 evolutions of guidelines, that an updated guideline set is not it.
Yeah.
And that maybe at this point we can kind of recalibrate and be like, okay, what really is the goal here? Where do we have some power to make the change that will actually start creating a dent in these chronic disease outcomes versus just sort of having more discussions about what the literature says about saturated fat and heart disease?
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you for reading it, EC, so that I don't have to. I always appreciate that. Before we go, just a quick reminder, 3pillarsmethod.com. If you want to be amongst the 10% of Americans who actually get enough fruit and vegetables, that's a pretty darn good way to do it. 3pillarsmethod.com. Get into the app, get onto the program, and also make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening or watching this so you don't miss another episode. EC and I will be back next week for a new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.